The town of Dry Creek was no more than a scattering of wooden buildings pressed against the endless plains, where dust clung to boots and the horizon seemed to stretch forever. In the middle of its single street stood a narrow cafe with faded paint and lace curtains, known simply as the Window. Its name came from the wide front window that framed the inside like a picture, giving passers-by a glimpse of the woman who worked there from sunup to sundown, Clara May Whitfield. Clara May had been a widow for nearly 5 years. Her husband, a ranch hand, had been thrown from a horse during a cattle drive, leaving her with more grief than money. When the small farm he left behind dried up in debt, she traded her land for the cafe and poured her strength into it. The townsfolk came to know her as steady, dependable, and quietly strong, though always wrapped in a kind of loneliness that clung to her like a shawl. From that front window, day after day, Clara was seen moving about the stove, lifting heavy pots, kneading dough, and stirring beans that filled the air with a hearty smell. Cowboys and drifters on their way through town came to her cafe for a hot meal and a brief moment of comfort. They laughed, clattered their spurs against the floorboards, and filled the room with stories of cattle drives, bad poker hands, and long nights under the stars. But for Clara, those voices were just passing winds. The cowboys would eat, tip their hats, and ride on, leaving her alone once again in the silence of the empty cafe. The wide window at the front became a symbol of her life, open to the world yet holding her apart from it, as though she were always looking out at others moving forward while she stayed behind. Despite the ache of solitude, Clara found a rhythm in her work. Every morning she woke before dawn, tying her apron around her waist and lighting the fire. She measured her days by the sound of the coffee pot whistling, the sizzle of bacon in her cast-iron pan, and the rattle of boots against the wooden floor when the first cowboys arrived for breakfast. She served them with a polite smile, never letting her sorrow spill into her voice. The men respected her for it. They called her Miss Clara or the Widow, never unkindly, but always with a certain distance, as though her loneliness set her apart. They knew her food was honest and hearty, beans cooked slow, biscuits soft enough to melt on the tongue, and stew that could chase the cold from a man's bones. But they also knew that when the meal was done, Clara would retreat once more behind her window, her face turned toward the horizon, her heart locked away. What Clara longed for most was not a husband in the old sense, nor the return of the man she had lost, but a companion who might sit at one of her tables and stay long after the plates were cleared. Someone who would see her not just as the woman behind the stove, but as a soul with dreams still alive, though buried deep. Yet such a thought seemed far off, almost childish, in a town where men came and went like tumbleweeds. So, Clara carried on. The cafe was her shield, her comfort, and her prison, all at once. Each night, as the lantern light flickered against the glass of the lonely window, she would rest her hands on the counter, staring at the empty chairs, and listen to the distant sounds of horses fading into the dark. And in that silence, though no one could hear it, her heart whispered its own quiet prayer. Maybe one day someone will come and stay. By the time the sun rose over Dry Creek, the cafe was already alive with the smell of coffee, bacon grease, and frying eggs. Clara May had learned long ago that cowboys kept time with the sun and their stomachs, not with clocks. The first customers usually came in at dawn, dusty and half awake from sleeping under the stars. They would tie their horses to the post out front, slap the dust off their hats, and shuffle inside, grumbling about the cold mornings or the soreness in their legs from long rides. To them, Clara's cafe was more than just a place to eat. It was a kind of refuge, a pause between the miles. Some of the men were rough and wild, their laughter booming as they teased one another about poker losses or fights with foremen. Others were quieter, bowing their heads politely as Clara filled their plates. But nearly all of them carried the same look in their eyes, the hunger of men who worked too hard and too long. Clara answered that hunger with heaping bowls of beans, thick slices of cornbread, and strong black coffee poured so hot it scalded the tongue. The regulars gave the cafe a kind of rhythm. There was Hank, the trail boss with a voice like gravel, who always ordered 2 biscuits extra for the road. There was young Jesse, barely out of boyhood, who tried every day to impress Clara with tall tales of cattle rustlers and saloon fights. And then there was Big Tom, a mountain of a man who could eat more stew than any 3 riders combined. He never said much beyond "thank you," but Clara could count on him appearing once every week when his herd passed near town. These men, and dozens like them, gave Clara's days a steady shape. They came in groups, ate, laughed, sometimes sang, and then drifted back out the door, leaving coins on the counter and a kind of emptiness in their wake. Their noise was almost comforting while it lasted, the chatter filling the cafe like music. But when the door swung shut and the dust settled, silence wrapped around Clara again. It wasn't that she disliked their company, far from it. She took quiet pride in the way they enjoyed her cooking. She knew which man preferred his eggs runny, which wanted his beans spiced with chili, which took his coffee black, and which demanded sugar. That knowledge, earned through observation and memory, made her feel useful, needed in a world that often seemed to have little use for women alone. Yet their visits were fleeting, like summer storms passing over the plains. She might share a laugh, accept a polite compliment, or listen to a brief story of the trail, but no one stayed long enough to know her. To them, she was the widow who cooked good meals, nothing more. When the plates were scraped clean, they mounted their horses and rode on, their voices fading into the distance while Clara stood at the window, her hands still smelling of flour and bacon grease. The cafe's big front window made her life feel like a stage. Cowboys glanced in as they passed, some tipping their hats, others pausing to grin before heading inside. To outsiders, it might have looked like Clara had all the company in the world, men coming and going from dawn to dusk, but behind the curtain of routine, her life was lonelier than most imagined. The Cowboys had trails to ride, ranches to return to, families waiting somewhere down the line. Clara had none of that. Her family was buried in the cemetery just beyond the cottonwoods, and her days ended where they began, in the small room above the cafe, where she slept alone with only the hum of the prairie wind outside her window. Still, Clara kept her smile ready, her apron tied, and her stove hot. Cowboys needed their meals, and she needed the small comfort of their passing company. It was enough to keep her heart beating steadily, even if it never quite felt alive. What she didn't know, not yet, was that soon a visitor unlike the rest would walk through that door. Someone who would not vanish with the dust, but instead linger quietly and steadily until her lonely rhythm began to shantage. Clara May had never been one to sit idle. The cafe demanded her hands, her energy, her patience. From dawn until late at night, there was always something to do. Scrub the counter, chop vegetables, wash dishes until her fingers wrinkled like old linen. Work filled the hours, but it never quieted the ache that lived beneath her skin, the ache of a woman who longed for something more than routine. Her neighbors often spoke of her with admiration. "That widow's stronger than any ranch hand," folks would say. Others whispered about how she could have remarried if she'd wanted. A woman who could run a cafe alone and keep it respectable was no small prize in Dry Creek. But Clara never entertained the matchmakers or the clumsy advances of men who smelled of whiskey and desperation. She wanted more than companionship, born of convenience or pity. She wanted something real, though she scarcely admitted it aloud. At night, when the last lantern was snuffed and the cafe lay in silence, Clara would climb the narrow stairs to her room above. She kept a small rocking chair by the window that overlooked the dirt street. Some nights she'd watch the moon cast its pale light over the rooftops, the town so still it seemed carved from stone. It was in those quiet hours that her restless heart spoke loudest. Memories of her late husband came and went like drifting shadows. He had been kind but simple, a man of few words and steady habits. Clara had loved him in the way a young wife learns to love, slowly, without fireworks, grateful for his protection and his laughter. His death had left her broken, but with time she had mended. The wound had scarred, yet beneath it there pulsed something she could not deny. A yearning for a love she had never quite tasted. A passion that was deeper than safety, richer than habit. Sometimes she scolded herself for these thoughts. What? Right had she, a widow, to dream of such things? She was nearing 30, her hair streaked with the faintest silver, her hands roughened from work. Cowboys rode through town looking for excitement, not permanence. Gentlemen wanted young brides, not women already bound to a grave. And yet the longing persisted, no matter how sternly she tried to bury it. Her restlessness showed itself in small ways. When she needed bread, her mind wandered, imagining what it might feel like to have a man's hands cover hers, not out of necessity, but affection. When she swept the floor, she pictured boots left at her door, not for a quick meal, but, because their owner lived there, shared the space with her. Even the sound of a fiddle drifting from the saloon stirred something in her chest, a reminder of dances she had never attended, of a girlhood cut short by loss and responsibility. The townsfolk never guessed at this hidden longing. They saw Clara, as steady, perhaps even content in her solitary life. She laughed when spoken to, smiled when men tipped their hats, and went about her work with quiet grace. But beneath the surface, her soul paced like a caged mare, searching for a gate that would never open. Then came the dreams. Some nights she woke with the echo of a voice in her ears, a voice she could not place. Other nights she dreamed of sitting across from a man at one of her own tables, the lamplight catching his eyes as though he'd been waiting for her all along. She would wake with her heart pounding, staring at the empty chair in her room until dawn lightened the curtains. Clara told herself it was foolishness, the imagination of a woman with too much solitude and too little company. But in truth, her restlessness was not something that would pass. It was a tide rising quietly inside her, drawing her toward a change she could not yet see. And soon, that change would arrive, not in the form of thunder or grand declarations, but in the quiet footsteps of a stranger whose very silence would speak directly to her heart. It was late afternoon when Clara first saw him. The cafe had been unusually quiet that day. The morning rush of ranch hands had long since passed, and only the faint clink of her spoon against a pot of beans kept the silence company. She was wiping flour from her apron when the cafe door creaked open, letting in a shaft of pale light and a tall figure framed against the dust of the street. The man stepped inside with a slowness that caught Clara's attention. Most cowboys barged through the door like they owned the place. Boots loud, spurs jangling, voices booming. This one moved differently. He paused just inside the doorway, removing his hat with a deliberate respect, as though crossing a threshold mattered. To him, his clothes were plain, trail-worn but carefully kept. His boots had the scuffs of miles traveled, yet they carried him with a quiet steadiness rather than swagger. What struck Clara most were his eyes. They were a storm gray color, sharp yet calm, the kind of eyes that seemed to see a man's past and future all at once. They swept the room, not in search of trouble, but in a measured way that gave the impression he noticed every detail. The wood stove, the worn tables, the lace curtains fluttering at the window. When his gaze finally met hers, it lingered, not boldly, not with the hungry look of so many others, but simply and steadily, as if acknowledging her presence was enough. "Coffee, ma'am," he said, his voice low and even. "Black, if you please." Clara nodded, more flustered than she wished to admit. She poured him a cup and carried it over. He sat at a corner table near the window, where shadows softened his expression. When she set the cup down, he gave her a small, almost shy nod. "Thank you." It was such a simple thing, yet it unsettled her. Most men who came through her door barely noticed her beyond the food she placed before them. This stranger, though, spoke as though her service carried weight. He drank the coffee slowly, savoring each sip instead of gulping it down, like the trail-worn men who usually passed through. Clara found herself watching him from behind the counter, though she quickly busied her hands with polishing mugs whenever he looked her way. Something about his stillness unnerved her. He seemed too calm, too sure of himself, yet not in the arrogant way of most cowboys. Rather, it was the calm of a man who had seen storms and learned to endure them. When he asked for a plate of cornbread and beans, she brought it without fuss, setting it down carefully. "Long ride?" she asked, her curiosity slipping through before she could stop it. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Long enough," he replied. That was all he said. No tales of cattle drives, no boasts about poker winnings, no talk of towns left behind. Just long enough, as though the miles didn't need explaining. Clara wanted to know more, where he'd come from, what his name was, whether he intended to stay, but something about his quiet presence kept her questions at bay. She sensed he was a man who would speak when he was ready and not a moment before. When he finished eating, he left coins on the table, more than enough to cover the meal, and gave her another small nod before stepping back into the dusty street. Clara stood at the window, watching his figure fade into the horizon glow. For the first time in years, her cafe didn't feel quite so lonely. And though she scolded herself for the thought, Clara found her heart whispering the question she dared not voice aloud. Would he return? The stranger returned the very next morning. Clara was already at the stove when the door creaked open, the dawn light spilling across the wooden floorboards. She turned, expecting one of the usual ranch hands who came for biscuits and coffee, but instead found those same gray eyes meeting hers. "Morning," he said softly, tipping his hat before sliding into the same corner table he had chosen the day before. Clara hesitated, her hand still on the skillet. Most men didn't come back 2 days in a row unless they were working close to town. But something about him, his steadiness, his quiet way, made her heart beat faster than she cared to admit. "What'll it be?" she asked, keeping her tone. "Whatever you're cooking smells just fine," he replied. That became the rhythm. Day after day he came in, sometimes at sunrise, sometimes in the late afternoon, but always taking the same table, always ordering simply and always eating with deliberate care as though every bite mattered. The other cowboys laughed, joked, and filled the room with noise, but he seemed content with silence. He never demanded more than coffee, a plate of stew, or a biscuit. Yet when Clara set the dish in front of him, his eyes would lift to hers, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. At first, Clara tried to ignore it. She told herself he was just another drifter, another man passing through. But as the days stretched into weeks, she felt those unspoken glances like threads pulling at her chest. When their eyes met, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be alone. The regulars noticed, too. "Your quiet friend's back," Hank the trail boss teased one evening, nodding toward the corner table. "Fella doesn't talk much, does he?" Clara brushed it off with a shrug, but heat crept into her cheeks. She didn't want to admit, even to herself, that his presence had begun to ease the hollowness of her days. He rarely spoke beyond polite words, but sometimes their silences felt like conversations. She found herself listening for the creak of the door, scanning the street through the cafe window, and baking an extra loaf of bread without realizing why. When he wasn't there, she felt it. The absence like a chair left empty at her own table. One afternoon, when the cafe was unusually quiet, she finally asked him his name. "Eli," he said after a pause, his voice as soft as always. "Eli Harper." She repeated it in her mind long after he left, as though the syllables themselves carried a secret warmth. There was a gentleness about him that unsettled her. Most men who came through Dry Creek were brash, quick to brag, eager to impress. Eli never tried. He spoke only when needed, worked his fork slowly, and never looked at her with the rough hunger that made her wary of cowboys. Instead, he watched her the way a man watches a fire on a cold night, quietly, gratefully, with no intent of smothering it, only drawing near enough for warmth. The stranger had returned often enough that folks in town began to take notice. He never said much, never lingered past sundown, but there he was, week after week, sitting in Clara's cafe by the window. Sometimes he ordered stew, sometimes just coffee. Always he paid with more than he owed. Always he tipped his hat with a quiet respect that set him apart from the rowdy cowhands who filled the room with noise. To Clara, his presence had become a steady rhythm, something she both dreaded and awaited. Each time the bell above the door chimed and he stepped through, she felt her breath catch. She still didn't know his name. He hadn't offered, and she hadn't pressed. But she felt the weight of his silence less like a burden and more like a mystery she was willing to bear. But not everyone looked kindly on him. One evening, just as Clara was wiping down the tables after supper, the town sheriff stopped by. Sheriff Caldwell was a broad-shouldered man with a lined face and eyes that had seen too much of human failings. He leaned against the counter, his voice low, carrying more weight than casual conversation usually held. "Clara," he said, nodding, toward the window where the stranger had just left his seat, "you ought to be careful about the company you keep." Clara frowned, setting her rag aside. "What do you mean?" The sheriff's gaze followed the retreating figure outside. "That man, he's called Eli Harper. Used to ride with a band that left more than a few graves in their wake. Word is, he walked away from 'em, but a man don't shed his past so easy. Folks will be wondering what he's doing here, sitting in your cafe day after day." Clara's hands tightened against the counter. Eli Harper. At last, the stranger had a name, though hearing it from someone else's lips felt like it had been stolen from him. She forced her voice steady. "And what if he's just tired of riding? What if all he wants is a hot meal and a quiet corner?" The sheriff sighed, pulling off his hat and running a hand through thinning hair. "Maybe so, but men like him carry shadows, Clara. Sooner or later, those shadows catch up. You've built something good here. I'd hate to see you lose it because you let your heart soften toward the wrong man." Clara bristled at his tone. She was no fool, no starry-eyed girl. She had seen death, worn grief, and carried loneliness as constant company. But she had also seen enough men swagger through her cafe to know Eli Harper was different. She didn't know his full story, true, but there was a quiet honor in the way he carried himself, something the sheriff's warnings couldn't erase. Still, that night, when she latched the door and stood by her window, Clara couldn't shake, the unease curling in her chest. Eli's past, whatever it was, felt like a storm on the horizon, too distant to touch but too large to ignore. Her unease only deepened days later when two rough-looking riders came through town. They weren't regular cowhands. Their eyes darted too sharply, their hands rested too close to their guns. Clara noticed the way they scanned the cafe as though searching for someone. When their gaze lingered on Eli's empty corner table, her heart skipped. The whispers had found him. That evening, Eli returned as calm as always and sat in his usual place. Clara served him stew with steady hands, but her eyes betrayed the questions she couldn't ask in front of others. He caught her gaze, and for a moment, The quiet in his expression broke. He gave the faintest shake of his head, as though to say, "Not here. Not yet." Clara nodded, though her heart raced. She realized then that her cafe, once a refuge, had become part of something larger, something dangerous. She could no longer pretend Eli Harper was just a quiet man passing through. His past had come with him, and soon it would demand its due. The cafe was quiet that evening. Only a few ranch hands lingered over their plates, speaking in low tones that blended with the soft creak of the stove. Clara moved between tables with practiced ease, but her thoughts were fixed on the man at the window. Eli Harper. The name still echoed in her mind, heavy with the sheriff's warnings and the unease of those two strangers who'd passed through town searching with watchful eyes. Eli sat as he always did, his hat resting on the chair beside him, his gaze distant. But Clara noticed something different tonight. He wasn't calm, he was taut, like a man holding his breath beneath the surface of deep water. His hands, usually steady, toyed with the rim of his cup, his knuckles pale. When the last customer left and the bell above the door stilled, Clara knew she could no longer let the questions gnaw at her. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and turned to face him. "Eli," she said softly, her voice firm but not unkind. "The sheriff told me your name. He told me some of the stories that follow it. You owe me no explanations. But I can't stand here, cooking for you, talking to you, and pretend I don't wonder. So tell me, who are you really?" For a long moment, Eli didn't move. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the stove. Then, slowly, he set his cup down and lifted his eyes to hers. "My name's Eli Harper, like Caldwell said," he began, his voice low and worn. "And he's right. I used to ride with a band of men who weren't worth the dust on their boots. We called ourselves free, but truth is, we were outlaws. We took what wasn't ours, left towns broken. Some didn't walk away from our passing. I stayed too long, did too much I ain't proud of." Clara's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "One night," Eli continued, his eyes far away, "a job went bad. Real bad. We were supposed to take a stagecoach, money, nothing more. But one of the boys, he got greedy. Pulled his gun. Too quick. Folks died, Clara. Innocent folks. That was the night I rode away. Left my gun with him and swore I'd never draw it for blood again." He leaned forward, his voice weighted with shame. "I've been riding ever since. Never staying too long, never settling, just looking for, I don't know, redemption maybe, peace, if such a thing's meant for me. And when I came into your cafe, sat by that window, I don't know why, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe." The confession hung in the air, raw and heavy. Clara's heart pounded. She had expected pieces of truth, a hint of danger, but not the full weight of guilt etched into every word he spoke. She crossed the room slowly, her apron brushing against the floorboards. When she reached his table, she set her hands gently on the wood, leaning closer so her words wouldn't tremble. "Eli Harper," she said softly, "you've carried your shame longer than most carry their pride. I won't pretend I don't hear the danger in your story, but I also hear the man who walked away when he could have stayed. You chose something different. That counts for more than you think." Eli's eyes glistened, though he blinked the emotion away quickly, like a man unused to letting it show. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara shook her head. "Afraid? Maybe. But fear ain't the same as distrust. And if trouble comes looking, then let it. I've been lonely long enough. I'd rather face danger with someone worth standing beside than live safe behind this window alone." For the first time since she'd known him, Eli let out a soft, unguarded laugh, a sound low and warm, carrying more hope than he likely realized. He reached across the table, his calloused hand brushing hers, hesitant but real. In that moment, Clara understood. Whatever storm his past might bring, She had already chosen her place, at his side, come what may. The storm Clara feared broke, sooner than she expected. It was past midnight when the pounding of hooves shattered the stillness of Dry Creek. Clara bolted upright in her bed above the cafe, heart racing. The sound wasn't the casual rhythm of riders passing through town. This was sharper, hurried, like wolves closing in on prey. She hurried to the window. Moonlight glinted off the barrels of rifles as 3 men dismounted in front of her cafe. Dust still clung to their coats, and their movements carried the edge of men hungry for trouble. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask who they were looking for. Eli. Within moments, fists hammered against the cafe's front door. "Harper!" one of them bellowed, his voice slurred with whiskey and rage. "Come on out, you coward! You thought you could run, thought you could hide behind a woman's skirts? Show yourself!" Clara's legs trembled, but something fierce sparked inside her chest. She couldn't let them storm the cafe, not while Eli was still asleep in the small room he had rented out back. Not while everything she had built was at stake. She lit a lantern, marched down the stairs, and through the door latch. As the door swung open, 3 pairs of eyes fell on her. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady though her pulse pounded in her ears. "You're making quite a racket for decent folk trying to sleep." The leader sneered, his teeth flashing in the lantern light. "Where's Harper? We know he's here." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "All I've got here is stew gone cold and coffee near boiled down to tar. You're welcome to either if you've a mind, but I won't have you banging on my door like a pack of coyotes." The men exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the answer they expected. Behind them, the horses stamped and snorted, restless, in the night air. "Don't play games with us, widow," the leader growled, stepping closer. "That man's a traitor. Rode with us once, then turned his back. We aim to settle it." Clara's hand tightened around the lantern handle. Her voice dropped, low and certain. "If you've got quarrel with a man, take it to him face to face, but you'll not bring violence through my door. Not tonight, not ever." The words left her mouth before she realized what she had done. She had chosen. She had placed herself between Eli and the danger that hunted him. Just then, a shadow moved at the edge of the lamplight. Eli stepped forward from the side alley, rifle in hand, his gray eyes calm but unyielding. "That's enough," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of steel. The outlaws turned, startled by his sudden presence. For a long moment, no one breathed. Clara could see the tension in Eli's stance, the restraint of a man who had seen too much killing but would not hesitate if pressed. "You want me," Eli said evenly. "Leave her out of it." But before the men could answer, Clara stepped forward, placing herself at Eli's side. Her lantern light caught the sharp lines of his face, the weariness etched deep into him. She felt his presence like a shield, but also like a burden she was now willing to share. "She's with me," Eli added, his voice firmer now. The silence that followed was heavier than gunsmoke. The 3 outlaws stood tense, their hands hovering near their holsters, eyes fixed on Eli and Clara, as though deciding whether to draw or to walk away. The lantern Clara held flickered in. The wind, casting long, trembling shadows across the street. "You're making a fool's choice, Harper," the leader finally spat. His lip curled into a bitter sneer. "Standing with a woman, letting her share the risk. You think she'll thank you when your enemies burn this place down?" Clara's voice rang out before Eli could answer. "This place is mine," she said fiercely. "Every board, every nail, every pot and pan. If you think I'll let a pack of cowards scare me from it, you don't know me at all." Her words hung in the night air, bold and unshaken. Eli glanced at her, a flicker of awe softening the steel in his expression. He had faced gunmen before, but never with someone willing to stand beside him when the bullets might fly. The leader snarled. and stepped forward, but Eli's rifle came up in a swift, sure motion. "Don't," Eli warned, his tone calm as stone. "You know how this ends if you push it." The other two men shifted uneasily. One muttered under his breath, tugging at his partner's sleeve. "Ain't worth it, Jeb. Not with him staring us down like that. Not with her standing there like she don't care if she lives or dies." Jeb, the leader, looked between Clara and Eli, frustration burning in his eyes. But at last, he gave a sharp curse, yanked his reins, and swung into the saddle. The others followed, throwing one last hateful glance before thundering off into the dark, their hoofbeats fading into the empty plains. For a long while, Clara stood frozen, her breath ragged, her hands trembling around the lantern. The danger had passed, but the weight of what she had done pressed down on her. She had defied armed men, risked not only her cafe but her very life, all for the sake of a man who might still ride away come morning. Eli lowered his rifle, his shoulders sagging as though years of weariness had settled back upon him. He turned to Clara, his voice soft, almost broken. "You shouldn't have stood up for me. You could have been killed." Clara met his eyes, her own steady despite the fear still twisting in her chest. "And you? Were you going to face them alone? Let them drag you off while I stood inside pretending I didn't care?" She shook her head firmly. "No, Eli. I've been alone too long. I won't stand by and watch someone I believe in fall without a fight." The words caught in her throat. She hadn't meant to say them so plainly, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. Eli's gray eyes softened, the hardness in them breaking like glass under sunlight. He stepped closer, setting the rifle aside, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a gentleness that belied the danger just past, he reached for her hand. Her heart hammered at the simple touch. It was rough, scarred, and unfamiliar, yet it felt like the anchor she had been searching for all her life. "Clara," he whispered, his voice unsteady. "I can't promise safety. My past will always follow me. But if you're willing, I'd stay. I'd fight for something better. For you." Tears burned her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the sharp, overwhelming truth. She had already chosen him the moment she opened her door to danger. Love had its price, and she had paid it willingly. The dawn that followed was unlike any Clara had known. The cafe, usually her prison of routine, now seemed to hum with a new kind of life. The morning sun spilled through the wide window, painting the walls in gold, and for once, Clara didn't feel the silence as a weight. Instead, she felt it as possibility. Eli had stayed the night, not in the shadows of the back room where he sometimes rented a cot, but awake at her side after the outlaws had ridden off. They hadn't spoken much. Words felt too fragile after the confrontation. But their silence was no longer empty. It was shared. When Clara came downstairs to light the stove, she found him already there, leaning against the counter, his hat in his hands. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "I should be leaving," he said slowly. "Men like Jeb don't give up easy. If I stay, I'm bringing danger to your doorstep." Clara studied him, the weariness in his shoulders, the scars life had carved into him. But beneath all that was a man who had looked her in the eye and chosen to stand beside her, no matter the cost. She set the coffee pot down and shook her head firmly. "You're not bringing danger here, Eli," she said. "Danger's been following you a long time. But last night proved something. We faced it together. And I'd rather share a future full of storms than sit behind this window alone, waiting for a life that'll never come." Her voice trembled at the edges, but her conviction was clear. For the first time since her husband's death, she was not speaking as a widow clinging to what she had lost, but as a woman daring to reach for what she could still gain. Eli's eyes softened, the gray in them brightening with something she hadn't seen before. hope. Slowly, he crossed the room and took her hand. His grip was warm, steady, as if anchoring himself to her, just as she had anchored herself to him. "I've been riding alone too long," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't think I deserved more than the road, but you make me think maybe a man like me can build something worth keeping." The words struck her deep. She squeezed his hand, then smiled, small, shy, but brimming with promise. "Then don't leave, Eli. Stay, not as a drifter, not as a shadow. Stay as mine." For a long, tender moment, they stood in the cafe's quiet, sunlight framing them through the window that had once been her prison. Now, that same glass seemed like a doorway, outward, toward the world they might face together. The day's work soon called, and Cowboys trickled in as usual. Clara served coffee, stew, and biscuits, but her steps were lighter, her smile brighter. Eli sat at his corner table, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone claimed and claiming. When she passed, their eyes met, no longer unspoken glances, but a language of their own. Whispers ran through town, of course. Folks speculated about what it meant, whether the widow had finally given her heart, whether Eli Harper could be trusted. But Clara no longer cared for gossip. For the first time, in years, she didn't feel defined by loneliness. She felt chosen, and she had chosen in return. That night, when the cafe doors closed and the lanterns burned low, Clara stood again at her window. Eli came to stand beside her, their shoulders brushing. Together, they looked out at the quiet street. The horizon stretched wide and open. The lonely window was no longer just hers. It was theirs, and beyond it lay a future neither had expected, but both were ready to claim, one not built on fear or solitude, but on love, courage, and the promise of a shared tomorrow.